Hi everyone, this is Dr. Serge. Let's talk about a big topic today is the history of our chronic issues and specifically the history of the diet recommendations that we had for about 50, 60 years now. Is how did that start and what happened back then and what were the impacts of these recommendations back then on chronic health issues. So one of my followers brought me back this article that we can see on the screen is 50 years ago, sugar industry quietly paid scientists to point blame at fat. So back then in the 50s, we started to see a rise of heart disease. And we couldn't really figure out what happened back then is there was two schools of thought. There were some doctors who believed that was the consumption of saturated fat, like animal fats, like bacon and eggs and cheese, that were to blame. And there's some other people that believe that it was sugar, okay, that was the cause of this increase of heart disease. There was big debate back then among these two types, these two clans. And unfortunately, the sugar school of thought won, meaning that they convinced the government that sugar was not the enemy. The enemy was fat, the consumption of animal fat, like I said, saturated fat and cholesterol. But this article brings back to light what happened back then. And as we can see here is she starts by saying that in the 1960s, the sugar industry funded research that downplayed the risk of sugar and highlighted the hazards of fat, according to a new published articles in JAMA. So the article she's referring to is this one, as we can see, is sugar industry and coronary heart disease research and historical analysis of internal industry documents. So this article goes really into the political side of what happened back then. They don't really cover the nutritional aspect of the heart disease, but what happened behind the scene and why the government sided with the sugar industry on this. Really, really fascinating to read. And we can see there was a lot of money involved back then, as you can expect when it comes to the sugar industry, which has a lot of power, a lot of money. So they really convince people that sugar is okay. You can eat sugar; it's good for you. Okay. Then, as you go down, you can see that she states that it was a very smart thing the sugar industry did because review papers, especially if you get them published in a very prominent journals, tend to shape the overall scientific discussion. So back then, when the sugar industry did is they came up with all those different studies to show that sugar is okay. You can eat sugar. There's no problem. There's no connection with heart disease, no connection with cancer, and so on and so on. But the problem is fat. So you need to stop eating fat. Otherwise, you're going to have heart disease. And this is what we've been hearing for the last 50, 60 years is the government, every couple of years, every 4 or 5 years, they recommend the same thing. They come up with similar guidelines. Don't eat sugar. Don't eat fat, sorry. Eat sugar. Sugar is okay. So your diet should be carb loaded. 60, 70% of your diet should be carbs with, at the end of the day, is sugar. They do recommend to eat some refined sugar. It's okay for you, but to cut back your intake of saturated fat and cholesterol as much as possible. Below 10%, they recommend even 5%. That would be even better. So, and we can see from these two different articles, that's really not the case. The enemy is really sugar. And back then, what happened is you may or may not have heard of this. It's called the McGovern Committee in the 70s. So that was a senator who put together a committee of people in the government and to study the question, okay, what causes what? Is it the sugar or the fat? And the interesting point in this, as you start researching this question, is this guy had connection with the vice president back then. And as you may know, when you have connections, you can get pretty much what you want. So the McGovern Committee, this guy believed that sugar was the fat. Okay, he was paid by the sugar industry to say that. Okay, that sugar can is fine. The fat is the problem. So he was convinced that sugar was not the issue. So he went to the vice president and said, listen, we know sugar is not the problem. The enemy is the fat. So we need to work on the fat. And they came up with the first recommendations a few years after, claiming that fat is something we need to work on. We need to cut out. And that was the first recommendation, actually. Is you look back, is they states that fat is a problem. You shouldn't eat bacon. You shouldn't eat eggs. You shouldn't eat cheese, red meat, and so on and so on. The really confusing point back then is, even today, is we've been eating those foods forever. Okay, we never had any problem until the 40s and 50s. So what this committee forgot to point out is, at the beginning of last century, we started to use more and more sugar in our food supply. And as you read labels today, as you look at what's going on, most of our foods, junk foods, processed foods, contain sugar. There's a direct connection. We know that today. There's so many different research articles and doctors and people supporting, claiming, showing that sugar was the problem back then, not fat. Okay, so this is something we need to make sure to really grasp our mind around, is fat is okay. It's not a problem. Okay. Trans fat, on the other side, is a big problem, which is something totally different we can cover later. But sugar is the cause of heart disease, cancer. We all know that sugar feeds cancer, and we need to stop eating sugar and carbs when you have cancer, for example. Osteoporosis is a sugar issue, 100%. I have so many patients who I help with, is we all work on sugar. So I have one of these patients, actually, this woman who came to me, 60, 61, a really bad osteoporosis. My first recommendation is cut out all sugar. That's what she did. And I didn't use calcium. I didn't use minerals. I didn't use vitamin D. I didn't use anything but just increase your protein, your fat intake, and cut out all the sugar, the carbs. So she followed a really low carb paleo diet. And 1 year later, she went back to the doctor, and the bones got stronger 50%. Okay, doctors never saw that. It's like, how is that possible? Typically, when you have osteoporosis, it gets worse. You can maybe stabilize, slow down the process, but it gets worse over time. That patient, she really followed my recommendations, and she actually reversed osteoporosis, which is amazing to me. It's fascinating to see that we can do that, because bones are strong, really hard structures in the body, right? So we can reverse that by allowing the body to cut off sugar. The main reason of this is every time you eat one sugar, you need about 35 calcium to process the sugar. So most people don't eat enough calcium from your foods, the cheese, the raw milk, greens, and so on and so on. So if you don't eat enough calcium, your body will take it from your bones. And that's what happened with her, is her diet was so off. Fix the diet, the bones got stronger. Okay, sugar is associated with pretty much everything. And I see so many people with chronic issues, and the first thing I recommend is cut out sugar. Eliminate all sugar of your diet. Just by doing that, it allows your body to have a break. It allows your body to actually self-healing itself. Because sugar leads to mineral deficiencies like calcium, zinc, magnesium, potassium, chromium, and so on and so on. So sugar is really one thing we need to cut out. So these recommendations back then were totally wrong. They were totally the opposite of what they needed to do. We know today we need to focus on good protein, good fat, and low carb. Okay. The last one I wanted to bring is this graph. Okay. A lot of people claim that, you need to stop eating red meat and all animal proteins, and so on and so on, because it's bad for you. We know today that's not the case. Animal proteins are safe if it's organic, grass-fed, pasture-raised, no chemicals, no pesticides, no hormone, so on and so on. The old-fashioned meat. Okay, not the processed meat that we get from Tyson, for example. Okay, so if you look at this graph, this is the consumption of animal protein. They break it down by different categories for the last 100 years. Okay, if you look at the yellow line, okay, this is the consumption of chicken. We all been told that we need to eat more chicken and less red meat, and this is exactly what happened in this country. the consumption of red meat has been decreasing for the last 50, 60 years, and the consumption of chicken has been increasing in parallel. Okay, there's a shift that happened. So we've been eating less red meat and more chicken and more turkey. So in general, we've been eating more poultry. Okay, pork has been more or less the same, as you can see. But the funny thing, the really interesting thing in this is, as we've been eating less red meat, we've been seeing on the other side an increase of cancer, an increase of heart disease, an increase of diabetes, an increase of obesity, osteoporosis, autoimmune issues, and so on and so on. You see my point? So as we've been following the recommendation by the government, eating less red meat, we've been seeing more issues on the other side. So if red meat was really a problem, we should have seen a decline in those different conditions. That's not what we observed. Okay, we could maybe suggest that red meat may be beneficial for you as a protective mechanism for the body. And there's quite a bit of evidence on that, actually. I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but red meat is not the enemy. It has quite a bit of nutrients. It's one of the superfood, I call it. Of course, it has to be good quality, right? It's all about the quality. When people claim that red meat or meat in general is bad for you, is because they refer to the processed meat that we get from those big farming corporations, which is totally wrong for me. So I don't believe in that. I don't support that. The animal has to be grass-fed and it has to be pastured and so on and so on. So it has to be coming from your local farmers, not those big farm corporations. So my point of that is, fat is okay. You can eat fat. Don't be guilty about it. I hear that so many times from people is, I shouldn't eat meat. My doctor said don't eat meat. I feel bad about it, but I like it. That's okay. Don't feel guilty. It can be part of a good quality diet when it's balanced, when it's part of a balanced diet with vegetables and nuts and fruits and so on and so on. So the point of tonight is, the recommendations from the government is totally wrong. It should be reversed. And some countries, actually, like Sweden, started to recommend a low-carb, high-fat, moderate amount of protein. And we all know that Swedish are pretty healthy. They are the second population in the world that live the longest, the healthiest. Okay, I hope it makes sense. So if you look at below, I put a link for you to get a free ebook. It's a PDF on how to detox. This is one of the main things that I do with patients, is how to properly detox. And diet is the foundation. And you need good amount of protein and good quality fat to properly detox. And there's a lot more to it. But if you read the ebook, you're going to see how to use diet, nutrition to remove these toxins out of your body. If you have any questions, you let me know. You can write a comment below. Thank you for watching. God bless you all.